So if the local skeptic says they accept that you can know math, logic, and empirical things, the next step up from is quite a jump from local to global. And it's not that they doubt the existence of globes, it's that their doubt is very broad. So at this level, kind of your standard global skeptic would have kind of a universal doubt about things, and they would kind of embrace the classic problems. So if you ask them, do you know if there's an external world? Do you know that we're not in the matrix? Or that, do you know this is not just a dream? They would say, no, I don't know that. So they think the problem of the mind, a problem of the external world, unsolvable problem. Similarly, the problem of their minds, which is a question of how do you know that other beings have the thinks and feels as you do? They would say, no, we don't know that either. What about metaphysical claims? No, don't know that. But they would still accept that we can know things like math and logic. How would that work? Well, essentially like this. This could be the matrix. This could all be like a dream. But even in a dream, do squares still have 4 sides? Does a dream square and a real square, whatever that means, have 4 sides? Yeah. Does 2 + 2, is that 4, whether you're dreaming or awake? Yeah. So you can know things that in a way have nothing to do with the world. So all that math and logic stuff you could know. Now, what if this is not enough skepticism? What if the world is not enough, to quote a James Bond film? Well, in that case, we've got more than the world. We've got super global, or sometimes known as extreme skepticism. This includes like the stuff of the predecessor, universal doubt, et cetera, but they go one step beyond. And they deny knowledge of mathematics and logic. So literally everything unknown, everything's up for doubt. Even 2 + 2 being 4, even triangles having 4 sides. Now we'll see when you look at our good, you may wonder like, well, how could someone doubt 2 and 2 is 4? How could someone doubt that squares have 4 sides? Well, our good dead friend Descartes, he's interestingly an example of a extreme skeptic, but also he's doing it to beat the skeptic. And he undercuts mathematics and logic. So as a quick kind of example, how can someone ever doubt that squares have 4 sides? Because when you draw it out, it looks badly drawn. It looks totally off. It's got 4 sides, no problem. But when you think about it, it's not as simple as that, because when we're counting, we rely on our memory. So 1, 2, 3, 4. What if my memory was being messed with by like an evil demon or something else? I could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 sides. 1, 1, 1, 1. 1 side. Now, we assume, of course, that our brains are working properly if you see the 4-sided square, but something can be messing with our ability to remember and count. And if it was, we would have no idea how many sides squares have. Now, again, this all sounds stupid, but we trust our memory. We believe our memory is reliable and we count properly. But we don't know. Now, kind of the irony of Descartes, as we'll see in the future, is that in a way he succeeds too well as a skeptic, and he just brilliantly creates an unsolvable problem that he thinks he solved, but spoilers, he does not. Now, as I mentioned, Descartes not trying to be a skeptic to be a skeptic, he's doing what's called methodological skepticism. It's when one is a skeptic to do something else. Descartes is probably the most famous example because his whole deal is he wants to explore the limits of skepticism and reach certainty. So he's being a skeptic to disprove skepticism. Now, there are others who adopt skepticism for other purpose. For example, there's an interesting approach among some thinkers as science was starting to push into religion to argue for skepticism, that you couldn't know things, to refute arguments against God's existence. And it's kind of a clever approach. So rather than arguing that God exists logically, they argue that you can't know things, so reason is useless. So the arguments against God don't work. So then you should believe based on faith. They were trying to, in a way, defeat reason and logic to make room for faith. One example of this was our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. He argues you can't prove that God exists, but you can't prove that God doesn't exist. And that leaves it open to believe in God for moral reasons or because of faith. So it's kind of an interesting approach to use skepticism to show reason is useless and then say, well, but believe this. Typically religion. But then, of course, the question can arise as Locke brings it up. But once you've destroyed reason and say you can't know anything, then how do you know that faith is reliable? And if the person gives reasons, they are back into not being a skeptic. And if they give no reasons, then you have no reason to believe them unless you already do believe them. So messy stuff. So those are our three levels of skepticism. And again, particular philosophers can be in different places on the spectrum. So it ranges from science, STEM's fun. Metaphysics, no way. To only math and logic are okay, to nothing. And then, of course, the final thing is being a skeptic of another type, not to be a skeptic, but for some other reasons. Before pressing on, what do you think about this? That needs more. Now, skeptics have been around a long time, going way back. Now, the earliest skeptics, the super early ones, were like the Sophists, who were opponents of Socrates and Plato. Then, after Socrates and Plato were pretty dead, then skepticism really got rolling. And kind of the classic battle, like Godzilla versus Mothra, Batman versus Joker, is between the people who claim we can know, called the dogmatists, and people who claim we can't know, the skeptics. So one of the big battles is between people who say you can know stuff, and those who say, no, can't know stuff. Now, the term skeptic comes from the Greek. This is, of course, English version of the Greek, skeptikos. Now, nowadays, of course, we think skeptic means doubting, because it does. But originally, skeptic, if you go back to the ancient Greek, it means someone who sifts or sorts. So the idea was that they were sifting through knowledge. And what they found is, in their sifting, they found their claim is they found nothing. There's no foundations for beliefs. Now, the most famous of the, new then, but super old now, one of the best known skeptics, well, you can't really say no, the best famous skeptic, maybe, was Pyrrho of Elis, 320 to 27 BC. He didn't create skepticism, but he brought it back. He revitalized it. And philosophy, science, all academic fields, they're rather like art and fashion. Namely, things come in for a while, like bell-bottom pants, or sometimes later called flare jeans. They're a thing for a while, and everybody's likes them, or most people do. Then they go out of style. They might come back in later. And kind of weirdly, people think academics and everything is driven by truth, but a lot of it is just driven by the same thing that drives fashion. It's just what people at that time are doing. And then people kind of move on to other stuff. Sometimes they go back, for a remake. So Pyro, he decides to bring back the old time skepticism. And being a proper skeptic, much like our good dead friend Socrates, he didn't write anything. Because one of the ironies of like the skeptics who write stuff down and argue is they're playing the philosophy, game. If they advance reasons and arguments, they're trying to convince you, and that seems to paradoxically mean they kind of like believe in arguments and reasons. And I've always kind of joked that the greatest skeptic in the world, of course, you'd never hear of because they wouldn't bother talking about it. They wouldn't bother trying to prove it because they would believe there's no point. In fact, someone you suspect the least could be the world's greatest skeptic because they would seem just like everyone else and they wouldn't be like trying to prove anything. They'd just be doing their skepticism. So what did Pyro sort of ironically do, or what did his students do? Because he did kind of a Socrates thing where Socrates himself just like talked about stuff and didn't write stuff down, and Pyro did a similar thing. He did basically Socrates, but his followers, students, wrote his stuff down. That's how we know about it. Now he presents essentially, he's revitalizing older arguments, so these go like way back for Pyro, but he's like one of the first named people we have who clearly lays out skepticism. And these arguments just keep getting recycled. To use an analogy to art, if you've had like a class on like film or literature, or just are into stories, etc. There's like certain just story paths that just constantly get reused. Also song lyrics, etc. And it's kind of the same way here. You have things that were created long ago, and then you get the same thing done over and over again, slightly different. Just like with with stories, you get the same story, basic story done over and over and over again, either well or bad. So he begins with the sense experience argument. And this one is still in use today. Much like tragedy, the basic tragedy, which the Greeks developed and perfected, I guess. It's like those around today, comedy, etc. So Pyro contended that sense experience can give us knowledge. Why not? Well, here's the problem. How do we know that our senses really match the world? That what's out there is really real, and we're not just like dreaming, hallucinating, whatever. And Pyro points out, seemingly truthfully, that we can never know this. Why not? Well, as Buckaroo Banzai said, no matter where you go, there you are. What does it mean? Well, this context means this. Can you ever get outside of yourself? No, because no matter who you are, you're always you. So Pyro points out, seemingly correctly, this problem. So here's a person, here's what's going on in their mind, and they think they're perceiving a square. Now, how could they know that the square matches this? Well, one thing you do is kind of like an analogy. How do I suppose I have you see a picture on like Facebook and you wonder, is this a real picture or is this entirely computer generated? Which is a fair point. They can do, there are programs where you can make an entirely fake person. So how could you tell if a picture on Facebook wasn't a real person? What's the most obvious way to check that? I mean, you can do an analysis, but if it's someone who's like local, you could go in. Yeah, you look at it, and if you look at the photo, you're like, yep. Because in that case, you're able to compare the image to the person, and you can say, yep, that's of that person. So that's real. But can we do the same thing with our idea? Can we get out of our own mind and see our mind and see the thing? No, because we're always, if we did see this, it would just be us seeing this. And then the question would be, what are we seeing? To use an analogy, imagine like a kind of like a Twilight Zone or Black Mirror scenario, where you wake up with no memory and you're in a completely enclosed room with all these TV monitors, and a voice yells at you, you must decide what is real. And you look at the monitors, like in front of each one is a button. And of course, since it's like Twilight Zone or Dark Mirror, something terrible happens to you. So could you tell just by looking at the monitors whether the thing that you're looking at is real or not? No. Could all be fake. And the problem is, of course, in this scenario is you can't get outside the room. There's no way out. And so metaphorically, that's the way we are. We're literally in our own mind, or we are our own mind, and we can never get out. And this argument keeps getting recycled forever. I mean, it's the foundation of Descartes' argument, and even today, people still bring that up. And the reason why is because no one's been able to really beat it effectively. Now, his other argument is the reason argument. So he's got the sense argument, roughly put, you can never get out of your own mind to confirm your perceptions are real. Then he considers a possibility, maybe you can think your way out of it. And he says, nope, why not? Well, what he claims is this, and this rests is kind of fueled by kind of maybe a misconception about philosophy, which is this, that for every argument you give, there's always at least an equally good argument to counter that. And this was developed later by later skeptics as a method. So if that's true, and this is one reason why people sometimes say that philosophy is just opinion, because you can argue for something and then have an equally good argument against it. And if that's true, if for every argument there's an equally good counter argument, you can never know which one is correct because they're both equally good. It'd be kind of like in a sci-fi scenario where they have the duplicate of the person, and if they actually were indistinguishable, there was no difference, you would never know which one was the real person because there'd be no way to tell. So he thinks this pretty much does it in. Senses can't solve it, reason can't solve it. So the skeptic wins forever. So if you're not a skeptic, what was their kind of classic position? What do you do? Well, the conclusion put forth by Pyrrho and his followers is that senses useless, reason useless. So you can't know. So what do? Well, you can only say like what things like seem like. Like it seems like we're in Rome. It seems like we're in Florida. It seems like it's after lunchtime. So what to do? Because it seems like you still have 24 hours a day to fill up. Well, what he says is this. They take a prudent approach. Now, critics, of course, call out like, well, why should you do any of this if you can't really like know anything? But that becomes kind of a big problem. So they say, suspend judgment, make no assumptions. So just like, if anybody says, do you know this? You just say, don't know. Which I guess we kind of know. Now, this also applies to morality. Is genocide evil? Don't know. Is giving, assistance to people who are in need good? Don't know. So what do you do? Well, what they advocate is becoming apathetic and indifferent. You know, like the silly demotivation poster, fight apathy or don't. So now today, of course, if someone is apathetic, what do we mean by that? Do we see that as like a negative? Like if someone, you know, posted on Facebook for you or you know, added you on Twitter calling you apathetic, would you say, why, thank you? No. But that would be considered an insult, because it sounds like, you know, it sounds a bit like pathetic, which is seemingly terrible. Now, in this case, apathy is not something negative. It didn't really have like a negative connotation, you know, back then. It comes from pathos, and pathos is feeling, emotions. Or it's where we get our term pathetic, which is now by pathetic we mean someone who is what?
Like somebody that doesn't care or sorry.
Yeah, if someone is fully pathetic, I mean, if someone like called you pathetic, would you be like, no? No, because pathetic is like lame, awful, worse than awful, you know, worse than awful. But all it really means is it comes from the emotions, pathos, having feelings, but it has come to mean essentially just, you know, worse than lame. But back in the day, being apathetic meant you lacked pathos, you lacked emotion. So the idea was you wouldn't be upset by things. And indifference, we generally think of indifference today as kind of negative. Typically, by indifference, we mean what we probably should use the words like cruel indifference. Because cruel indifference is ignoring something when it's like, it's actually, you know, harmful. But in this case, indifference means the person doesn't have a strong feeling one way or another. So what they're advocating is basically, don't worry, don't have the feels. It's in some ways it's kind of like many like wellness coaches, mindful coaches tell to do, like don't get like kind of like in some ways like the goal of like yoga is to be like really calm. Don't get upset. So again, this doesn't have like the negative connotations it has today. It's basically saying don't be upset, don't worry. So again, there's still a problem. What do you do? Well, again, the skeptics say, you don't know, but kind of weirdly, they advocated just go with the existing laws and traditions. Just go along. Why? Well, don't worry about things, don't get upset. You don't know what's wrong or right, good or bad, true or false, so just kind of go along. And so weirdly, if someone was like a true skeptic and believed all this, what would they be like as a person? They would be super normal. I mean, they would be like statistically average because they wouldn't get upset about things, they wouldn't be mad, and they would just go along with the laws and traditions. They probably wouldn't even, the only way you kind of maybe notice them is if they just didn't get upset about things. But even that wouldn't be very noticeable because usually we notice when people get upset, not when they're not upset. So it would just be someone who would seem kind of calm, just going along with everything. Now, on one hand, does that have some appeal, like being calm and not upset? Yeah, but people make moral arguments that are there some things you probably should be upset about? Yeah, lots of things. And also, could laws and traditions be like awful? Yeah, I mean, this is a logically consistent position. If you can't know anything about morality, then yeah, you don't know if the existing stuff is good or bad, so why bother doing anything? But a standard criticism is, well, this skepticism just leads people to be super conformists. Now, after Pyrrhonian skepticism, much like bell-bottom jeans or Flair, they were bell-bottom and Flair. I think came back again. I just lost track of the name. So they'll be back again in the future. They come back every so long. One thing, if you live long enough, you see everything come out of fashion, get back into fashion, come back. It's strange. So like every 20 years, people look like the same, dressing basically the same. It's like a roughly a 20-year cycle. That's not entirely true. You do see a cycle of clothing. There's only so many ways you can make clothing. So our next skeptics were the so-called academic skeptics. And the reason why they're called academic skeptics is because Plato's Academy. They got taken over by, ironically, taken over by the skeptics. So when Paracelsus, with whom probably horribly pronouncing his name because it's all Greek to me, 316 to 242 BC, after Plato died, it was taken over by the people. The academy kept going for a while. Just like, for example, FAMU's been going, for quite some time. We've had different presidents, etc., and keep on going. So when this guy took over, he decided to take the academy, quite ironically, and make it skeptical, as opposed to, Plato was very much against the skeptics, and so we ended up getting kind of a weird takeover. Now, this is not super unusual to have an institution taken over and then have like what it originally stood for be radically changed. Really common in politics and etc. You can have things that were like once like good become bad, things that were once like really conservative become liberal, and vice versa. And the only thing that's the same is the name in many cases. Now, the other famous dead academic skeptic was Carneades, 214 to 129. He took over, brilliant. He went to Rome as the Athenian ambassador when Rome was heading towards becoming the Roman Empire. This is like pre-imperial. And back then, because there was no Netflix or Hulu or Twitter, weirdly, philosophy was like super popular. Like philosophers were famous. It'd be like being a rock star actor today. Not so much. So kind of the big entertainment for people in some cases would be philosophers giving speeches. Like I said, things become fads and go out of fashion. Now, what he developed, and I mentioned before with Pyro said you can have an argument for something, have an argument equally as good against it. And the Carneades developed this into what became called the two-faced method. Not two-faced like the Harvey Dent, like the Batman villain, but the idea was this. Carneades would go and give a brilliant speech for something. Say like why spouses should be faithful. Then he'd come back the next day and give an equally brilliant speech for the exact opposite, that people should not be faithful. And they were equally, supposedly equally good arguments. And the whole point of this for him was to prove that you can't know anything, can't know anything, because you can argue equally well for either side. Now, one lasting impact of this is that, of course, to this day, philosophy still has a reputation of being just opinion, that you can simply argue for one side or the other. Now, for Carneades, that would be totally true, but he would believe it to apply to everything: engineering, physics, medicine, etc. So not just philosophy. So how did the academic skeptics justify their being skeptical? Well, one thing that occurs, not surprisingly, in institutions is that as an institution's been around for a while, people will decide that the institution has kind of like lost its way. It's lost its like origin. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're just trying to do something sketchy and pretending like it. They're going back to the beginnings. And so the claim was that the academy had lost the Socratic spirit. And again, you see this like in business and politics, where people will say like, this organization has lost its true spirit, we're going to go and make it great again. And sometimes they're sincere, and sometimes it's a scam. Sometimes both, a sincere scam. Now, again, given what we saw with Plato, who was all about knowledge and all against skepticism, kind of ironic. So how did they make this case? Because what people will do, obviously, if they're claiming they're going back to the beginning of the true spirit, they've got to give, especially in the context of philosophy, give some kind of like reason. And so this is what they claimed. They point to the fact that Socrates said he knew how much. Yeah, enough. And that seems skeptical. And his dialogues, typically, the Socratic method is basically arguing about stuff, and a person's like, I have no idea. And so you could make a case that often the Socratic dialogues ended up without a definitive answer. So not entirely like fiction. But of course, kind of the real problem is that Plato definitely, anti-skeptic, believed in knowledge. And even though the dialogues don't always end decisively, it's pretty clear that Plato believed in the forms, believed in knowledge, was anti-skeptic. So one might say that the skeptics who took over were kind of, reading selectively, what Socrates stood for. Now, again, outside of philosophy, this is also a pretty good strategy. People kind of like rebrand things either for good or for bad on similar grounds, appealing to some, predecessor they claim is like them, and they're just bringing things back. They're just making it great again. So what did the academic skeptics, what was kind of their arguments? Well, their main opponents were the Stoics and Epicureans. The Stoics were, the Epicureans were philosophers, actually mentioned in the Bible. They were big enough to, make the New Testament. Now, today we still use the term Stoic. If someone is Stoic today, what do we mean? Yeah, good control of their emotions, often very like tough and resistant to suffering. If we say like that person's really stoic, we see them enduring like hardships without control. Yeah, to be an Epicurean means what today? Could be argued, like, fine things. You can be an Epicurean about food, about art, etc. You like the finer things in life. Now, the original philosophies were kind of similar. The Stoics, really super simplified. The classic ones generally believe that the world is deterministic. There is no free will, there is no chance, there is no choice. Everything just happens. And they believe because of this, because you can't change things, what is must be. The only thing they claim, which again, maybe probably is inconsistent, the only thing you can control is your own response to things. That's what you can control. So they took the view that what you should do, again, they have entire books, etc. This just really smushes it down. They believe what you should do is, that's why I think the reputation for your lacking emotion, that you should be aware of that and realize that you can't change things, but you can control your own responses. So one should maintain control and not give in to the feelings. In one of their famous metaphors, they said, essentially what it's like is, everyone is like a dog tied to a cart being pulled by a donkey. You have two choices. One is you can resist and get dragged along and suffer. The other is you can trot along the cart and pretend like this is your choice. And one way is like pain and suffering, the other is not. And so the cart is basically the way the world is. The world just is. Then I don't mean like in terms of like the power structure. It's like metaphysically is what it is. It's like you're a character in a video game, and the script is run. You don't get to pick what you do. You're just doing that, or like a character in a movie, and your only control is how you respond to it, whether you're, I guess, given to the suffering. Or don't. And so they're really big about how what matters is someone's, how you feel about it, and you have control over those feelings, or so they think. Now, Stoicism has been kind of misappropriated and misused and distorted on the internet. So if you see someone claim to be a Stoic or appealing to Stoicism, they might be like doing real Stoicism, or they might also be doing something that's, pretty distorted. If you want to check, probably the ones to go to are like the original Stoics. Probably one of the best is Marcus Aurelius, the famous Stoic emperor. If you saw Gladiator, he's different from the fictional character, but that's the guy. And that's kind of classic Stoicism. If someone is pushing like racism and stuff, they're not doing original Stoicism. They're doing the new thing. The Epicureans believe that in hedonism, that pleasure is the highest good. And both of these, the thing that of course the skeptics were concerned about was both the Stoics and Epicureans claimed to know things. And so they were fighting them over that. So one stock, reply back to the skeptics is that some things seem like, and later figures like John Locke will use this, some things seem like we can't really doubt them. We have the expression seeing is believing, and we would think, especially things like pain. Locke, as we'll see, we talk about Locke later. Locke says, hey, you want to be a skeptic? You doubt whether there's a world or not? Okay, go over and stick your head in that box. And of course, no one's gonna do that. And so the kind of counter is there seem to be some things that just seem totally true. I can't doubt it. And they bring up the dream and hallucination argument, which later gets stolen by Descartes, which is this could all be a dream or hallucination, which seems totally real until like you realize it's not, definitely not real. And so they bring up, we don't know for sure if these like the first people to bring up the dream hallucination argument, but this also becomes a stark argument. How do you know what you're experiencing is real? This could all be but a dream or hallucination. And then later when you get to tech, you get, the matrix. So as was mentioned, the skeptics, the philosophic skeptics, in a way they still do philosophy because they're philosophers, but in a way it's kind of like ironic or paradoxical because they argue that you can't like in a way know arguments, or know they're any good or bad or not. So it's kind of a weird kind of thing. So one of the arguments they build that later becomes part of the skeptical toolkit, again, still used to this day, is there's no criterion, there's no standard for truth. Because here's the problem. If you're going to know, you got to know that something is true. And they agree with Plato, you've got to give like a reason why. You've got to give a justification. So how do you know that something's true? Well, they run what's called an infinite regress, which is bad. And it works basically like this. If you say that I know this is true because of X, the obvious thing to say is, how do you know that X is true? And then anything you bring up, they can always just ask, how do you know that's true? It's kind of like when a person's given an explanation, and they say like, why is the sky blue? And you reason, why is that? Why is this, forever? And so they run this infinite regress where every time you give like a standard, like this is how we know something's true, they just ask, how do you know that's true? And then you give a reason, and they say, well, how do you know that's true? And they can play that game forever, ever and ever. Hence the infinite mirrors. Now, clever skeptics, of course, if you say, aha, clever skeptic, do you know that you don't know? Do you know for sure that no argument can work? There's no standard of truth. They, of course, would say, No, that we appear to lack knowledge, and they actually kind of weirdly suspend judgment about their own skepticism. So if someone's like, again, if someone's like a consistent skeptic, they would have to say, do you know if skepticism is true? They would say, don't know. Now, as you might imagine, people kind of pushed on this, like, well, what do you do? You know, okay, we're all skeptics, then you kind of realize, wait, I'm getting bored of being a skeptic. What do I do? So what Carneades did is he tried to respond to this. The Stoics said, hey, because they were the nemesis skeptics, they said if you were like truly consistently skeptical and you doubted all this was real, it would seem that the true skeptic would just kind of like sit in the corner and then just like die, you know, because maybe nothing is real. Should they eat lunch? You know, don't know. Should they drink water? Don't know. Should they do anything? Don't know. And so the Stoics made a good point. Like if you're a real skeptic, you should just be over in the corner, you know, dead. And Carneades said, you know, ruh-roh, raggy, and said, okay, how do we respond to this? And he had on a compromise. And of course, you know, you've got a compromise when everybody hates what you're doing. So his compromise was this. He said you couldn't be certain, but you could have probability. That, to use a modern example, you don't know if there really are buses, but there probably are, and that if you step in front of one, it will probably hurt. Now, the Stoics said basically no, that this, again, being kind of compromised, they said this doesn't work because if you bring up probability, you aren't a skeptic anymore. Because even though like you're not certain it's 100%, you are still talking in probabilities. So their claim was this is not really skepticism. And of course, other skeptics said, yeah, that's not really skepticism either. So it ended up in kind of unpleasant place where the enemies of skeptics said, you know, that's not going to work. And other skeptics said, yeah, that's not going to work either. Now, after the academics, there was a response of, you know, basically, using the analogy of politics, you always get kind of like political group forms in response, groups later fall apart or change, new group forms, group changes, etc. throughout history. The names sometimes say the same, but you know, the content keeps changing. And as I said, skepticism was huge. It was big. It was like that Netflix and Facebook. Not really, of course, but it was a big thing. Skeptics were cool back then. So the academics ended up sort of, because of that compromise, they ended up basically kind of losing the fight. So to use like a political analogy, it was kind of like when Chris Christie said something nice about Obama way back, and that kind of doomed Chris Christie forever, that kind of thing. So academic skepticism blew up. But whenever something fails, there's often something to step into its place. And along came the revival of Pyrrhonian skepticism. So Pyrrhus, he revived skepticism, and then long after his death, someone brought back his bringing it back. And we ended up with, you know, skepticism revised again. Because of the purists said that the academy is not pure enough. Skepticism has become tainted. Now, again, you see a similar thing, you know, by analogy in politics, where you have a party which, you know, people might say the party has lost its way, it's not pure enough, and they'll try to get back to what they perceive as being the pure version of that party. So the revised Pyrrhonian skeptics, purified skepticism and formalized it. Now, the most famous of these Pyrrhonian skeptics was a fellow named Agrippa, who developed the 5 pillars of skepticism. Now, in a way, the pillars aren't like, they're not like a religious foundation. Like some religions have like pillars, there's like the pillars of Islam, etc. So it's not like a religious thing. These essentially are 5 arguments the skeptics use. And Agrippa believed that these 5 arguments would defeat any attempt to beat the skeptics. And here they are. And these still around today. So the reason why this is relevant is because today these arguments haven't really been beaten and still around. The first one is disagreement. Not everyone will agree on an issue. Now, is that true? Yeah, I mean, even things you think there'd be like a lot of agreement, like waffles are delicious, there'll be some people who disagree. I think waffles are not delicious. They're waffle heretics. And so pretty much anything you can find, kind of weirdly, you can obviously find at least one person that disagrees. Now, by itself, does that show we can't know anything? No, because the people who disagree could be wrong, like they're wrong about waffles. Waffles are properly made, objectively delicious. I mean, I admit there could be bad waffles. So the first one is true, but also totally consistent with skepticism being false, because you can believe people who know stuff, it's just some people can be totally wrong about that. Now, one of the probably the deadliest pillar is the infinite regress. And this is one they stole from earlier skeptics and kind of polished it up and sharpened it into a skeptical superweapon. And it's what we've seen before. If you're going to like settle that we know something, you got to give reasons. You got to justify your reasons, and then you got to justify your justifications. And again, like we saw before, every reason you give, you got to give another reason, because someone can always say, why is that true? And this is the infinite justification regress, which means you can never give a reason that satisfies the skeptic. And so it would seem you can never know. So this one is pretty powerful because if it does work, it does destroy knowledge. And what philosophers since then have tried to do is try to stop that regress, to find something that justifies that doesn't need justification. So far, spoilers, pretty much nope. Next, relativity. One thing they found, well, people probably know this, people know this since they're people, but perceptions differ in different circumstances. I mean, standard example, and one we'll see later for a different purpose, is suppose you try to answer the question, suppose I have a bowl of water, and the question is the water in the bowl cool? I don't mean like cool like Fonzie, but cool like as in not being warm. And they would, someone would probably say, well, I put my hand in it. Yes, it feels cool. The water is cool. And then, of course, a clever skeptic would say, aha, but now put your hand in this ice for a while. Now put your hand back in the water. Is that water still cool? And they'll say, it's now warm. And so the skeptics would point out perceptual relativity, different circumstances, different things, seem, feel different. Another example, also a very practical one, is paint color. Anybody ever like painted like their apartment or house or anything? Yeah, and when you go to buy paint at like Lowe's or Home Depot, they recommend that you do what with the samples? Yeah, take some home, because the lighting in like Lowe's or Home Depot is usually fluorescent lighting, and it can be very different in your house. So, a paint that is, good in this terrible lighting could be like way too dark, like in like a bathroom or something. I found myself, I had like this this really good blue color, but when I came, I had a bathroom that has no window and small one light, it was like being trapped in the abyss. I was like, oh, I gotta light that up. It looked fine everywhere else, but there definitely not. Yeah, and so what color looks like, there is no true color. There is just how the color looks in different light. And friends of mine who know about like makeup, like theater and so forth, that's why they explain to me like why they have these fancy mirrors and all kinds of adjustable lighting, because I just have a mirror. And it makes perfect sense because depending on like when you're doing your thing, like in play, lighting and so forth, you need your makeup to look different, which is totally true. So it all depends on the circumstances. Now, of course, this by itself doesn't prove that we don't have knowledge. It just shows that things look different under different circumstances. In fact, this later gets like repurposed to talk about the primary and secondary qualities we mentioned back earlier. Now, one thing that in response to like trying to beat the infinite regress people try is a hypothesis about knowledge. What they try to do is say, here is the thing that breaks the regress. This is how you know. Later becomes known as foundations. So you might say, whatever you perceive with your senses clearly, distinctly is true. Or what is shown by the natural light of reason is true. Now, what the skeptics argue is that any starting point you pick, any foundation you pick is arbitrary. Because you could find like another equally good foundation that's different, even contradictory, and so none of them are justified. And if you try to justify your foundation, then you end up here, circular reasoning, that you'll end up just running in a circle. Now, in logic, circular reasoning is it's a fallacy, bad logic. It's when one assumes as true what needs to be proven. The simplest version would be, why am I right? Because I'm right. Premise one, I'm right. Conclusion, I'm right. And that, of course, just assumes what needs to be proven. So if I say that, the light of pure reason gives us the truth, justifiably so, well, if I give a reason for it, I'm in the infinite regress. If I don't give a reason, it's like pretty arbitrary. And if I just assume it's true, I'm going in a circle. So the skeptics believed these 5 pillars take care of all of the arguments. And again, there's a certain irony and paradox in the fact that they use arguments, because in order for these to work, you've got to kind of assume things like logic works, that arguments work, that infinite regresses are a thing, that they're bad, etc. You've got to believe that circular reasoning is a fallacy. And so kind of a weird kind of problem is to actually do philosophical skepticism, you've got to accept like all of the mechanics and trappings of philosophy. And you kind of like using math to show you shouldn't believe math. It's like, well, don't you have to kind of assume math to disprove math? But if you assume math, it kind of means you don't disprove it. So it ends up in a weird case. So, as often happens, we had the 5 pillars of skepticism, and then it's all about like rebranding. They didn't call it that, it's a relatively recent term, but philosophy does kind of a similar thing, where it's popular for a while, it drops out of favor, and then you get some like new revision. In this case, the revision was this: the new improved skepticism, instead of having those 5 cumbersome pillars, now you have 2 theses, which are these. So they distill it down to 2 things. One, nothing is self-evident. So you just can't know things just self-evidently. So kind of against Plato. And secondly, nothing can be proven. And if those are both true, then you can't know anything. Now again, the skeptics run into the problem or paradox of, if these are like true, then skepticism is true, but then you could seemingly like know these 2 things. Which is why, I always have the joke that the truest and greatest skeptic would never write anything or say anything. They would just be like, skepticism, that would be it. They'd be done because they realize you can't argue, why even bother? So they also run into the problem of this, kind of a practical problem. Again, I kind of picture like, kind of humorously, fictionally, I picture like, two people talking about skepticism, they're both convinced, and they look at their watches like, well, what do we do? What do we do now? Which is a good question for any philosophical view or anything is, what do we do now? So this is what the skeptics claim. And on one hand, it seems like maybe good, maybe appealing. So the first one is personal peace. Why? Well, it's like the song, don't worry, be happy. Yeah. Because if you can't know, no reason to worry. Like if someone can't pay the rent, they don't know if there's actually, if they're not going to be able to pay it or not. They don't even know if there's rent. If someone's got seemingly incurable cancer, they don't know if cancer is real. They don't know if they're going to die. And so in a way, it's kind of like being delusional in a way, where someone just doesn't believe anything. In a way, a person could be at peace that way because nothing negative would ever stick. They just simply wouldn't believe it because they can't know. So kind of maybe appealing. I guess it's the old saying that ignorance is bliss, taken to the extreme. Now, like the earlier skeptics, they also were like weirdly conforming. Like I said, with these, even though they seem like kind of radical, you can imagine it's kind of humorously, you can imagine someone like talking all this radical skepticism stuff, but then it turns out they're just like totally average and just do totally follow the customs and laws and never need to exactly follow the physical norm. So like the skeptics before them, they said, well, accept what appears to be. So just act like this is all real and follow the existing customs and laws. So if someone was a skeptic like this, they would seem to be just super normal because they would just be, accepting everything at face value. They wouldn't be too upset about anything, and they would just be following existing, they dress the socially acceptable way to dress, they behave the socially acceptable way, they would have, follow the existing laws. They'd be super normal. Which again, in a way, seems kind of odd that someone would, embrace this radical skepticism and then just be, totally normal. So why was skepticism important? Well, eventually, as you might imagine, since you don't see like skeptics out on the, outside, giving skeptical speeches to the applause of many. You don't see like, skeptics ruling the world. Oh, what happened to them? Why once they were like dominant, but now their dominance is ended. They never totally died off though. It's kind of like how dinosaurs had their day, but they're still around. They're all over the place. Everywhere. Currently. Although we don't call them dinosaurs now, we call them birds. They're just dinosaurs. Dino birds. So the problem that the skeptics ran into, which I've repeated kind of many times, is since they're playing the philosophy game, they're making arguments. They have starting points to their arguments, and they expect people to believe their arguments. So they seem to be like embracing all this stuff. Like the analogy I gave, would be like trying to disprove math with math. Then, well, if math is trustworthy, it can disprove itself, then in a way that's a paradox. It kind of can't. So either it works and disproves itself, or it doesn't, it's not disproven. Now, despite that problem, it did make some important contributions. And again, it's still around today. It's just not, you just don't see like, cool skeptics, out speaking in front of crowds and getting applause and, awards and being ambassadors and stuff. So one effect it has is that if other philosophers had to respond to it, the skeptic would come along and say, how do you know that? And other philosophers are like, well, I got to do some proof. So in this regard, skepticism is kind of good because it provides like, criticism and a check on other philosophers. So if you're a philosopher, either you were like had to be a skeptic, or you had to fight. Pretty much those are the options. Either you're like, yeah, I don't know anything, or have to fight these skeptics. Now, our good dead friend St. Augustine, not the Florida, but the actual saint, he wrote a bit against the academics, because St. Augustine was around during the time period, became a saint, moved to Florida. I guess still playing golf now. No, I don't think ever moved to Florida. Also, other philosophers adopt skepticism as a methodology, basically a tool, because one of the things that people have been trying to do is get to certainty. As we'll see with Descartes, what you can try to do is see what you can't doubt. You be as skeptical as possible until you find something that can't be doubted. And as I mentioned before, interestingly, skepticism became like weaponized, perhaps ironically, to support faith. Because as I mentioned, when science was on the upswing, it was perceived correctly as a potential threat to religion. And so there was like a pushback against it. And one of the interesting pushbacks was, if you could destroy faith in reason, belief in reason, this would support faith and revelation. So if reason is useless and can't prove anything, believe based on faith, what has been revealed. And that was a major contribution. It's still a thing used today. If one can undermine reason and show that it's unreliable, one can offer faith and revelation in its place, either in good faith or as a scam and a deceit. It's also believed that it had a contribution to science. In fact, today, if you talk to the cool kids in the sciences, the ones that have the cool YouTube channels that are doing sciencey stuff, they'll always talk about how they're also skeptics. They don't mean like old school doubting everything skeptics. They mean the skeptic who, subjects things to a critical assessment and has depth. So skepticism is still, powerful. And I guess the cool science YouTubers, if there is, that makes any sense, they are all typically explicitly skeptics. Because, all the cool kids are skeptics. So although people do still talk about skepticism, and again, if you talk to like big names in sciences, they'll express their belief in science, but they'll also talk about the importance of skepticism, of not simply believing things just because. So why did skepticism, as like a big popular movement, why did it fail? Well, one thing is it just seems like just time kills everything. It's kind of like, well, why did bell-bottom jeans go out of style? Once they were cool, then they were up. Why did people stop wearing their hats backwards? They used to be like the thing. Now I don't see that much anymore. People still do that, like the backwards hat thing. It kind of went out. And if you're catching, playing baseball, that's the original turning backwards. So it just kind of fades out. People get bored. So skepticism failed for some good reasons. One, they said, hey, if you're a skeptic, you'll achieve peace. But would it really? Like, for example, suppose like you told yourself, I don't have to pay rent. I don't know if rent's ever going to be due. That worked. Well, would it? What if someone doubted the existence of landlords? Yeah, that would seem to be I guess you could doubt the existence of the street. In the cold, in the rats with knives. Yeah, rats can use knives, kind of. They can hold in their teeth, stab at you. Yeah, they can grab, I mean, they don't understand knives, but yeah, upgrade. We're at 3.0, they get knives. So watch out for those guys. Well, I've seen there's probably seen the video. There's one, the crab that grabs a knife. And he's like, it seemed to understand how that worked because it was menacing people. So the rats will get it next. So did not create peace because just like doubting stuff, delusion seems to result like not in happiness, but often in like death. It also created a lot of confusion. And probably the thing that really like wiped it out was it got out competed because it was unsatisfactory. Just people have said, okay, just doubt everything, but just go along with stuff. Don't worry, be happy. And of course, it ran up against Christianity. And did Christianity, how'd that work out for that newcomer to the Roman Empire? How's Christianity doing these days? Still a thing? Still Christians?
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, lots. Yeah, most. Yeah, sorry to worry. There's lots of. Yeah, Christianity's fine. It's doing good. Yeah, so Christianity kind of all competed because the skeptics say, you can imagine them like in a booth, skeptic booth, Christianity booth. Skeptics say, yeah, you can't know anything. Don't worry, be happy. And just go along, follow laws and traditions. And the next booth, you got like, Paul in the next booth saying what? Believe in us and you go to heaven. And people are like, that sounds a lot better than just like, just going along. Heaven sounds pretty sweet. And so religious philosophies, primarily Christianity, basically outcompeted the skeptics. And so skepticism never vanished. And later Christians sometimes adopted methodology, but it kind of just got outcompeted. Now, can the skeptic ever be beaten? And a pretty good case can be made. The skeptic always wins. Why? Well, again, as we've seen, skepticism philosophically is the view that we don't have knowledge, seemingly don't have knowledge. And it's defined, as we saw, by the extent of the doubt, how doubting you want to be. So you can take all the stuff we've looked at and kind of smush it into like a meta argument, put it all in one place. So here's kind of the stock argument for the skeptic. So in order for a belief to be knowledge, you've got to have a belief that is true, and it's going to be justified in some way, whatever that means. So as we saw, whatever standard a person gets, then you run that regress. There's always, if you say, here's why this justification is correct, then you just raise the question again, why is that correct? Now, if you don't offer any support for your standard, people have no reason to accept it. So if someone says, I haven't got any reason, people say, well, I'm not going to believe it. Well, here's a reason. Why should I believe that reason? And so either way, either you lose like in move one, or you lose infinitely in infinite attempts. So the skeptic is seemingly right. So how do people try to be the skeptic? Well, we'll see a lot of them in the future. But one popular thing is the self-justifying standard. You just see that it's true. Plato in a way kind of tried to do this. Now, this is easy to beat, because as the skeptic said, if you look at 10 different philosophers who offer self-justifying standards, you'll have like at least 10 different standards. So they can't all be right because they're inconsistent. And if you're going to pick which one's correct, you've got to have a standard, which takes us back to the old problem of how do you know which standard or picking your standard is correct. If you don't have a standard, they're all good, and then you got to accept contradictions as true. And that's even worse than skepticism, because skepticism is we don't know, and accepting contradictions basically means everything is like true. So for every reasonable argument that can be given, reasonable counter-argument, and essentially you can just run this forever. So next time we'll finish this up. For the exams and stuff, again, the due date's coming up, but I can either change that or just leave it because you still have the available until date. And I'll also check to make sure like quizzes that cover the stuff we haven't covered yet, they're available well past this. So I'll take care of that when I go to the office. So have a good rest of the day. See you in the future.
Pastor Roll.
I guess I forgot it. Sorry. Remind me next time. I got in the habit last year because it was just me and an empty room. I got in the habit of